Good morning, friends. Welcome to another episode of BNN with Bhante Sudaso. So this morning we will be studying the second part of this incredible, beautiful sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 9, the Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta. You can find the text in the live chat. And welcome to Buttarucci, also known as Michael, who already has a few questions, which is great. And welcome to Elaine. Good morning, Jens. And good morning, Gita, Grant, Kyle, who coined BNN, Sally, Ella, Marielle, and Sarah, and Kevin. Oh, Sarah is watching from the UK. So good afternoon, Sarah, to you. All right. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. And today we will hopefully get through the rest of the Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta. So we left off with the section on the three kinds of existence, three kinds of bhava. And Venerable Sariputta had just said that from the arising of attachment, existence, from the cessation of attachment, there's the cessation of existence. So he's pointing to upadana, so grasping, clinging, or attachment, grasping as being the basic precondition for the experience of self-identity, for the experience of grasping at a sense of self-existence, grasping at this experience of being an individual person, a separate entity. So the function of grasping, so this word grasping in Pali is upadana. So upadana, it has the prefix upa, which means close or near, and adana, which means taking. So upadana literally means taking close. So like reaching out to get something and bring it close to you. So again, we translate this as grasping, as clinging, or as attaching. But it does have this quality of reaching out for something to bring it in close to you. So what is it we're reaching at? What is it we're grasping at? We're grasping at anything that we like. We're grasping at anything which gives us a sense of self. So this is another rather perverse element of self-attachment, is that often what we're reaching at, what we're reaching for, what we're trying to grab, is not necessarily things that are pleasant, but rather things which give us a sense of individuality, a sense of personhood. So we grab at things that help to solidify or define or reinforce our sense of personality, our sense of me, our sense of self, whether they're pleasant or not. So a lot of people have actually quite unpleasant self-identities, quite unpleasant personhood. Because any sense of self, any sense of me seems to be preferable than no sense of me. A well-defined, painful sense of me seems to be preferable to a poorly defined sense of me. So we reach out to form a sense of self-identity. Who am I? What am I? We try to put answers to these questions by grabbing at parts of our experience and labeling them as me, as using them as a basis for building up a sense of self-perspective, for building up a sense of selfhood, of me and mine, and what I am and who I am, what defines me. And then we cling tightly to that fiction as though it was true. And this creates no end of misery and turmoil. This creates no end of suffering for us. So there's an incredible freedom in knowing that we are not anything in particular. We are not required to be anything in particular. So sometimes you'll hear people say things like, I am this way, I have always been this way, I will always be this way. Like, this is who I am. I am fill in the blank. I am the person who fill in the blank. I always have been, I always will be. Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Rather, that's simply a way of looking at ourselves that we've grabbed at for the time being, but it's not ultimately who and what we are. It's just something that we've grabbed at and identified as me, labeled as me. So in Buddhist practice, we're working to cultivate a flexibility of mind, a flexibility of perception, a flexibility of self-identity, the willingness to change any aspect of who we think we are at a moment's notice. So at a snap of the fingers, to be willing to drop what we're currently saying, doing, thinking, feeling, perceiving, identifying as, and exchange it for something better. In fact, this is the basis of Buddhist practice. It's recognizing we've been grasping at the unwholesome, so we can stop. That doesn't define us. So an example of this is with addiction. So people say, oh, I am an addict, I always have been an addict, I always will be an addict. And Buddhism says, BS, not true. In the past, you did behaviors which are based on addiction. In the present, you might still be doing those behaviors, but that doesn't define you. It doesn't control you. It's not who and what you are. Anything can be changed. If you change your behaviors, if you change your thinking, if you work on uprooting the subconscious tendencies of mind, then you will no longer exhibit the behaviors and personalities of an addict. That will change. And this applies to addiction to anything, by the way, whether it's addiction to intoxicants or addiction to television or addiction to junk food or addiction to sex or addiction to whatever it is you're addicted to. It's the same. We think, well, this is who I am. This is me. It always has been me. It always will be me. But no, it's not you. It never was you and it never will be you. Rather, it is a temporary behavior pattern which we voluntarily grab at and engage in, and which we then form a sense of self-identity around. So in Buddhism, we also need to get comfortable with the idea that we do not have a solid, persistent self-identity. So I've met a number of people in my life who have this desperate urge to have a clear idea of who they are. Like, I need to know who I am. I need to know what I am. Which to them meant they need to know what their likes and dislikes are. They need to know what their personality traits are. They need to have some clear sense of selfhood, some clear sense of what their enduring personality traits are. But from a Buddhist perspective, we don't have any. Because any of that can be changed at any moment. And it's all conditional. It's all causally arisen. So what we're actually doing when we think we're discovering our nature, what we're actually doing is we're building a perspective on nature. We're building a belief about who we are, not actually discovering who we are. We're building it, constructing it out of experiences. So this is the product, the process of Upadana pachaya bhavo. So from upadana, from grasping, clinging, attaching, comes self-existence. We grab at bits of our experience and we say, this is me. This is part of what defines me. This is part of what makes me who I am. And we stick that onto our self-view. We stick that into the part of our memory where we accumulate everything that we think defines us. So I am the person who hates cilantro. Okay, we stick that in self-view. That's me. I am the person who likes to take a nap in the afternoon. We grab that, we stick it on ourselves. I am the person who dislikes getting up early in the morning. We grab that, we stick it on our sense of self-view. But all these things are ultimately just artificial constructs that we build and put together. They're not necessarily ultimately true. In fact, they're definitely not ultimately true. So it's coming to recognize how we construct our sense of personality and individuality by grabbing at parts of our experience and cobbling them together in order to form this idea of who we are. So that was what we had left off with. So then the next step, so the monks ask, can there be another way that disciple of the noble ones has right view? And Sammādiṭṭhi says, there can be, venerables. Venerables, when a noble disciple understands attachment, understands the origin of attachment, understands the cessation of attachment, and understands the practice which leads to the cessation of attachment. This is how a noble disciple has right perspective, how his perspective is upright, how he is possessed of certainty and confidence in the Dhamma, how he is one who has arrived at this true Dhamma. But venerables, what is attachment? What is the origin of attachment? What is the cessation of attachment? What is the practice which leads to the cessation of attachment? So again, attachment here is upadana, which these days I'm mostly translating as grasping. So Sammādiṭṭhi says, venerables, these are the four kinds of attachment. Attachment to sensuality, attachment to perspectives, attachment to habitual practices, and attachment to the idea of a soul. From the arising of craving, there is the arising of attachment. From the cessation of craving, there is the cessation of attachment. And it is just this Noble Eightfold Path that is the practice which leads to the cessation of attachment. That is, right perspective, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. When a noble disciple understands attachment in this way, he is one who has arrived at this true Dhamma. So the four kinds of upadana. So we have kam upadana, so grasping at sensuality, grasping at sensual experiences. Dittupadana, grasping at viewpoints, perspectives, opinions, beliefs. So for example, a lot of people today believe that the pandemic is all some elaborate conspiracy, that it's all some elaborate hoax. So that's an example like grasping at an opinion, grasping at a belief. But this is actually quite broad in its scope. We have all kinds of bizarre opinions and beliefs that we grasp at and cling to tightly. We have it all the time. So from believing, grasping at the belief in which direction the toilet paper roll should be hung on the toilet paper dispenser. Should the fold be toward you or away from you? Oh, the arguments and debates that arise over this topic. Just mind-blowing. Ayasoma is giving me that quizzical expression. Apparently she's never experienced this. Such a sheltered youth. But actually, you see this coming up in all kinds of debates and arguments, where we have our opinion, our belief, and we cling tightly and desperately to it, even to the point of getting backed into a corner of needing to defend something absurd and untenable. Or we're simply unwilling to engage in any discussion which might challenge our opinions and viewpoints and beliefs. So I was raised with a completely faith-based belief system. And I was taught that the most dangerous thing in the world is any conversation which might challenge your faith. And I was taught to do everything I could to avoid exposure to information that might challenge my faith. So what does this come from? It comes from attachment to viewpoints, attachment to opinions, attachment to beliefs, to the point where one is desperately afraid of encountering any information which might shake that belief system. But this is not the Buddhist viewpoint. The Buddhist viewpoint is, you don't need to be afraid of anything because Buddhism is an unassailable tower. No information can shake it. No information can tear it down. And if something does tear it down, then it was meant to be torn down in the first place. If there's some critical flaw in the system, then let that flaw be exposed. It's only through exposing flaws that we can counteract them and correct them. So similarly, we should be willing to have our opinions and viewpoints be pointed out as flawed and distorted. And we should be willing, we should be overjoyed, in fact, if somebody else can point out flaws in our opinions and viewpoints and beliefs, because they're helping us. They're helping us correct our mistaken opinions. How valuable is that? How wonderful is that? And then attachment to habitual practices. So this is reminiscent of obsessive compulsive disorder. So the belief that you have to do things in a particular way, that you must do things in a particular way. So attachment to habitual practices. So thinking that there's a certain way that things need to be done, and whether there's good reason for it or not, we keep doing it in that way over and over again. Or the belief that engaging in certain practices will be for our good and benefit, even though we have no basis for that belief. So attachment to habitual practices. So thinking things must be in a certain way and cannot be done in another way. So this is all pointing to a rigidity of mind. So in Buddhism, it's necessary to cultivate an extremely flexible mind. An extremely flexible mind which can adapt and accord with anything it encounters. So the Buddha said, I do not argue with the world. Rather, it is the world that argues with me. In other words, the Buddha says that he's at complete accord with everything in the world. Every aspect of reality, when he meets it, he's just like, oh yeah, no problem, gotcha. Yeah, I see your place in this, you fit in as well. But it is others who do not understand reality that find some problem with what other people think, with what other people do, with the way things are. So in Buddhism, we're cultivating this flexible mind, which can accord with whatever conditions we encounter. And that willingness to, at any moment, to change how we do things and how we think. If we see any reason whatsoever to believe that our behaviors and thought patterns are counterproductive, inaccurate, not conducive to awakening, then we have the flexibility to change them immediately. And the fourth one is attavad upadana. So atta means self or soul. Vada means literally statement or doctrine. And upadana is, once again, grasping or attaching. So attaching to the doctrine of self, attaching to the belief in self-existence, attachment to teachings about a persistent, ongoing soul, or attachment to the concept that we have a persistent self-identity. So similar to what I was saying earlier, how we construct who we think we are, we construct a belief about who we think we are, and then we cling tightly to it. As though it was real and not just some artificial construct. And what's especially amusing, by the way, and I see this with one of my sisters in particular, I've known her for a long time, my whole life, in fact. So I've watched her go through many changes over the years. I've watched her personality shift and change. I've watched her viewpoint shift and change. I've watched her preferences shift and change over the years. But then I talk to her these days and she's like, I've always been this way. And I'm like, come on, sister, you haven't always been this way. 10 years ago, you liked different things. 10 years ago, you believed different things. 10 years ago, you felt a different way. 10 years ago, you had different preferences. You haven't always been this way. But we form this idea of this is who I am, therefore, this is who I always have been and always will be, despite the fact that reality is constantly showing us otherwise. So when we look honestly at the components of our self-identity, then we recognize that they've been changing all along. They were never stable in the first place. So this whole concept of self-identity, this whole concept of personality is a total fiction that we build up out of our current experiences. Pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? And we believe this fiction that we tell ourselves because it seems preferable to the alternative, which is not having a personality, not having a self-identity, not having a belief about who we think we are. But as it turns out, the alternative is actually incredibly freeing. It's joyful because it gives us the ability to meet every moment with unshakable serenity, knowing that nothing in any moment can challenge us because there's no us to be challenged. And here he points to craving as being the basis of clinging. So he says, from the arising of craving, there was the arising of attachment. From the cessation of craving, there was the cessation of attachment. So tanha, craving, this one of the core evils in Buddhism, craving. This is the basis of grasping. It's the basis of grasping at sensuality, at viewpoints, at habits, and grasping at self-identities. Comes from craving. So then moving on to the next section, he says, so they ask, is there another way one can understand right view? And Sariputta replies, there can be. When a noble disciple understands craving, its origin, its cessation, and the practice which leads to the cessation of craving. This is how a noble disciple has right view, and so on. But what is craving, its origin, its cessation, and the practice which leads to its cessation? Venerables, these are the 6 categories of craving. Craving for visible objects, craving for sounds, craving for fragrances, craving for flavors, craving for tangible objects, and craving for mental phenomena. From the arising of feeling, there is the arising of craving. From the cessation of feeling, there is the cessation of craving. And it is just this Noble Eightfold Path that is the practice which leads to the cessation of attachment. That should be cessation of craving. Okay. So minor typo here. I'll fix that later. So he says, it is just this Noble Eightfold Path that is the practice which leads to the cessation of craving. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So here he's emphasizing craving for sensory experiences. So craving for sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental phenomena. So thoughts and emotions. So the phenomena in the mind. And I find this especially interesting in that he says this is the basis of the forms of grasping. So even grasping at a sense of self is based upon craving for sensory experiences. Craving for sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, thought. Craving for a particular experience of body and mind is what leads to us forming a sense of self-identity, forming a sense of who we think we are. And that's what leads to us grasping and clinging tightly to viewpoints and opinions. to particular habitual practices as well. Ultimately, it comes down to wanting to see certain things, hear certain things, smell certain things, taste certain things, touch certain things, and think certain things. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. We want to have particular sensory experiences. And why? Because we like them. So he says, from the arising of feeling, there was the arising of craving. Well, what is feeling? Feeling is painful, pleasant, and neutral. So we feel something pleasant and we want more of it. That's craving. We feel something unpleasant and we want less of it. That's craving. We feel something neutral and we want to ignore it. Or we want something more interesting. That's craving. So one of the lovely things I find about this is that as we continue with this investigation, going deeper and deeper into the mind, we find that all these complex things on the surface, these complex belief systems and complex self-identities, ultimately comes from really simple stuff. We like pleasant feelings, we don't like unpleasant feelings. So it boils down to this very simple, animalistic, instinctual approach of moving towards what we like and moving away from what we dislike. It's actually that basic binary response from which we build this whole wild complex of who we think we are, what we think we are like, what we think our true nature is, what we think reality is. All these complex mental labyrinths. They're built out of this basic on-off switch of liking and disliking, pleasant and unpleasant. Which is not surprising because I'm looking at a computer right now, which is exactly the same thing. It's all kinds of elaborate structures built out of this basic binary switch, zeros and ones. So why is it surprising at all that our mind is the same way? We have all these complex, abstract opinions and viewpoints about the world and about ourselves and about reality, but it really just comes down to what we like and what we don't like. We're no better than a cat or a worm in this respect. And I like cats, by the way. But it's just recognizing we think we're so special, but actually we're operating on this extremely crude, primal, animalistic level. And everything that we think makes us wonderful and special is built up out of this crude, primal, animalistic level of mind. So then they ask him, again, is there another way we can understand right view? And he says, there can be. Venerables, when a noble disciple understands feeling, origin, cessation, and practice, as before, and he says, there are 6 categories of feeling. Feeling born from eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and mind contact. From the arising of sense contact, there's the arising of feeling. From the cessation of sense contact, there's the cessation of feeling. So again, applying the same 6 categories. So there's 6 kinds of craving. So craving for sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, based on the 6 kinds of feeling. Feeling from seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and cognizing. So this should come as no surprise. So it's still coming back to sensory experience. And these feelings are coming from sense contact. So then carrying on with that, then the next section, he's saying, when a noble disciple understands sense contact, its origin, its cessation, and the practice which leads to its cessation. And there are these 6 categories of sense contact: eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and mind contact. He says, from the arising of the 6-fold sense base, there's the arising of sense contact. From the cessation of the 6-fold sense base, there's the cessation of sense contact. So the 6-fold sense base is eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. So again, the next section Sariputta says these are the 6 sense bases: the eye sense base, the ear sense base, the nose sense base, the tongue sense base, the body sense base, and the mind sense base. So the 6 ways that we relate to the world, the 6 ways that we identify what we like and what we dislike, the 6 ways that we build a sense of me. We build a sense of me seeing, me hearing, me smelling, me tasting, me touching, me thinking. It comes down to these senses. But the 6 senses, he says, from the arising of mind and body, there's the arising of the 6-fold sense base. From the cessation of mind and body, there's the cessation of the 6-fold sense base. So he's pointing once again to something more primal. Why do we experience the 6 senses in the first place? Well, it's because we have mind and body. So without mind and body, there would be no experience of the 6 senses. So then the next section, he says, Venerables, when a noble disciple understands mind and body, its origin, cessation, and practice which leads to its cessation, he says, what is mind and body? Feeling, identification, volition, sense contact, and attention. This is called mind. The 4 great elements in the physical form, which is composed of the 4 great elements, this is called body. Thus, this is body and this is mind. This is called body and mind. From the arising of consciousness, there's the arising of mind and body. From the cessation of consciousness, there's the cessation of mind and body. And it is just this Noble Eightfold Path which leads to the cessation of mind and body, and so on. So here we find this basic definition of mind and body, nama rupa in Pali. So nama is mind and rupa is body. You also see that translated as name and form, but that's really missing the point here. So again, nama is clearly defined as being the mental components. So Vedana, Sanya, Cetana, Phassa, and Manasikara, I believe. Let me just check the Pali, make sure I have that right. Yeah, Vedana, Sanya, Cetana, Phassa, Manasikara. This is called mind. So again, it's these basic components of willpower or volition, of identification, of placing labels and identities on things. So Vedana, feeling. It's interesting that feeling here is mentioned at the stage of mind and body, which is before the 6 senses. So there's still this basic sense of liking and disliking. Even before there's a sense of what we like and dislike. And attention. So what we direct the mind towards, what we point the mind at. So these are the elements of mind. And then the 4 great elements is earth, water, fire, and air. So the solid physical components which make up the body are the ways that we relate to physical components. And so he says that mind and body is based on consciousness. That consciousness is the fundamental precondition for the arising of mind and body. So this is coming down to the primacy of mind. So all things arise from the mind. All things ultimately originate from the mind, which is clearly stated in the first line of the Dhammapada, by the way. The Buddha says, mind is the precedent of all things, the most powerful of all things, the creator of all things. Mano pubangama dhamma mano seta manomya. So mind is the foundational creator of all phenomena, the foundational basis for all phenomena. So from the arising of consciousness, there's the arising of mind and body. From the cessation of consciousness, there's the cessation of mind and body. Then they ask, there another way to understand this? And he says, there can be. When a noble disciple understands consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the practice which leads to the cessation of consciousness. This is how a noble disciple has right view, and so on. But what is consciousness? And he says, Venerables, these are the 6 categories of consciousness. Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. From the arising of formations, there's the arising of consciousness. From the cessation of formations, there's the cessation of consciousness. And it's just this Noble Eightfold Path which leads to the cessation of consciousness, that is right perspective, and so on. So this is very unusual in that here, again, this is before the arising of the 6 senses in the sequence. Yet he defines consciousness in terms of consciousness of the 6 senses. So this seems a bit peculiar. And elsewhere in the suttas, at this stage, consciousness is spoken of apart from the 6 senses. So why is it in the sutta that it's spoken of in terms of the 6 senses? I'm not sure. To me, this seems a bit peculiar. I'm not quite sure what's being gotten at here. Unless it's meant to be a predilection or an ability to cognize 6 senses. Because at this stage, there are no 6 senses to be conscious of, and yet there is consciousness. So perhaps it's, again, indicating consciousness as the ability to be aware of things, rather than an actual awareness of anything in particular. Which again would indicate a consciousness independent of the 6 senses. And he says, from the arising of formations, that's sankhara. From the arising of sankhara, there's the arising of consciousness. From the cessation of sankhara, there's the cessation of consciousness. So naturally they ask, is there another way? He says, yes, when a noble disciple understands sankharas. And what are sankharas? He says, these are the 3 kinds of sankharas: bodily sankhara, verbal sankhara, and mental sankhara. So the word sankhara needs some explanation. So here it's translated as formations, which is one of the blander of the tolerable translations. Other translations which are somewhat tolerable, construct. I'm actually quite fond of construct as a translation for sankhara. Conditional phenomenon. I'm very fond of conditional phenomenon, though it's a little clunky. It's very precise, albeit clunky. I'm fine with clunky as long as it's accurate, by the way. Ayasoma has a different viewpoint on this one. She prefers poetic, even if it's a bit imprecise. Sankhara can also be translated more simply as object or thing. So a very simple way of translating the word sankhara. So sankhara means anything which can be identified as a separate object, which is an interesting thing to even say, because from a Buddhist standpoint, there are no separate objects. There's no such thing as a separate object. The appearance of separate objects is the projection of a delusional mind, which is exactly what's being said here, because it says, from the arising of ignorance, there's the arising of sankharas. From the cessation of ignorance, there's the cessation of sankharas. So in other words, the appearance that there are separate objects, some of which are physical, some are verbal, some are mental, arises directly from delusion. This belief that there actually are separate individual things, independently existing objects, whether physical or mental, is a direct product of delusion. The direct product of misunderstanding the nature of reality. And it's through misunderstanding reality as being composed of separate objects that there then comes to be consciousness. So consciousness, the sense of awareness of separate objects. And then it's from that consciousness that there arises mind and body. So there's this awareness of separate objects. So then the question is, well, but which objects are me? Oh, this body and mind is me. These objects are me. The other objects are not me. And then the whole process unfolds from there, of further differentiating and chopping up the world into seemingly separate objects and identifying which ones we like and which ones we dislike, and trying to get the ones we want and avoid the ones we don't want, and grasping at the ones we like, and forming a whole viewpoint and belief system and self-identity, and building up this entire mass of dukkha, all out of this fundamental delusion, misunderstanding that the world is composed of separate, distinct objects. Fun times. And by fun, I mean painful and miserable for eons. Hashtag Buddhism. So, that's sankhara. And then they ask, is there another way we can understand? And he says, there can be. When a noble disciple understands ignorance, understands the origin of ignorance, understands the cessation of ignorance, and understands the practice which leads to the cessation of ignorance. This is how a noble disciple has right view, etc. He says, Venerables, when there is no knowledge of dukkha, no knowledge of the origin of dukkha, no knowledge of the cessation of dukkha, no knowledge of the practice which leads to the cessation of dukkha, Venerables, this is called ignorance. That's avidya in Pali. He says, from the arising of the taints, that's asava, from the arising of the taints, there's the arising of ignorance. From the cessation of the taints, there's the cessation of ignorance. Now, isn't this interesting? Normally, dependent origination is said as starting at ignorance. But here, Sariputta, Venerable Sariputta is saying that there is a cause also for ignorance. Ignorance is caused by asavas. It's caused by the taints. So, how does this function? So the next section, they then say, is there another way we can understand this? And he says, yes. He says, when a noble disciple understands the taints, the origin of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the practice which leads to their cessation, then one has right view. He says, Venerables, these are the three kinds of taints: the taint of sensuality, the taint of existence, and the taint of ignorance. From the arising of ignorance, there's the arising of the taints. From the cessation of ignorance, there's the cessation of the taints. So that's interesting, isn't it? He says, ignorance arises from the taints, and taints arise from ignorance. So it's this little loop which he has spinning around itself. So in this, then, he's not actually saying something dramatically different from the normal formulation of dependent origination, which starts at ignorance. Because what he's pointing to is that ignorance and defilement are interdependent. They roll around each other. They're fundamentally manifestations of the same thing. So the asavas, these basic fundamental corruptions of mind, are inseparable from avidya, from this fundamental delusion, this fundamental ignorance. It's also noting, by the way, that he defined avidya as not knowing the Four Noble Truths, not understanding the Four Noble Truths. Then finally, he caps off the sutta by saying, Venerables, when a noble disciple understands the taints in this way, understands the origin, cessation, and practice which leads to the cessation of the taints in this way, then having completely abandoned the subconscious tendency towards passion, having removed the subconscious tendency towards aversion, having destroyed the subconscious tendency towards the conceit I exist, having abandoned ignorance, having given rise to true knowledge, he has made an immediately visible end of dukkha. This, Venerables, is how a noble disciple has right perspective, how his perspective is upright, how he is possessed of certainty and confidence in the Dhamma, how he is one who has arrived at this true Dhamma. This is what Venerable Sariputta said. Satisfied, those monks delighted in Venerable Sariputta's speech. That's the end of the sutta. So Venerable Sariputta here is concluding once again by pointing to the necessity of understanding these basic corruptions of mind. And through understanding these basic corruptions of mind, So the taint of sensuality, the taint of self-identity, and the taint of ignorance, then one can abandon the tendency towards greed, aversion, and delusion, and discard the conceit of self-existence, and therefore to reach the end of suffering, to reach full awakening. So at this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them in the live chat, and I'll answer them as best I can.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Bhante, for going through this beautiful sutta. Lots of Dhammasukha. And Bradley is like, and one of the taints is also ignorance. Cringing emoji.
Busted.
And Jen says, agree. Cringing emoji. But let me scroll all the way on top. So Michael had originally asked, I see that Venerable Sujato translates ahara as fuel, which, although less literal, seems to carry the sense better than nutrient or sustenance. I like fuel. I see that aharati translates as brings, produces. Maybe produces relates. I like fuel for ahara. If you said this already, forgive me.
Yeah, I had mentioned that before, and I also quite like the translation fuel. Though I also feel it depends a bit on the context in which it's being used. So for example, in the Molya Pagana Sutta, I intentionally translated it as food because the Buddha uses the verb form later in the sutta, which seems to clearly mean feeding on. So translating it as food in that context allows one to catch that connection between food and feeding. In this particular sutta, it doesn't really matter because the Buddha, or in this case, Venerable Sariputta, only ever uses it in its noun form. So whether one translates it as nutriment or food or fuel or sustenance doesn't really make a huge difference. Yeah, similarly, I like fuel. It's a good translation. Though fuel is also sometimes used as a translation for upadana, which I don't like at all, by the way, but you will sometimes see it used in that sense. Sustenance is pretty good. I've never liked nutriment, ever. But it's possibly the most prevalent translation of the word ahara, which means we kind of have to get used to it because we're going to hear it all the time. Ayasoma likes it because it's exactly the same word in Italian, by the way. And apparently in Italian, nutriment is an extremely common word, whereas in English, it's an extremely rare word.
It's probably in Spanish as well, I would say.
Nutrimento.
Nutrimento.
Yeah. Anyway, any other questions?
Yes. Well, Marielle had asked while you were talking. Bhante mentioned flexibility of mind, self, and what else? And Karen is suggesting that it was perspective, but I don't remember.
I don't remember either.
Okay, so we'll go with Karen's. And Bradley apparently relates to the toilet thing. The toilet roll thing. The top of the toilet roll should face you. I will never be able to look at the toilet roll paper anymore with the same equanimity and never put any thought to it.
Well, I've lived in community for long enough that I've just had to get used to the fact that some people will put the toilet roll on backwards. And you just have to learn how to live with these things.
Yeah, like who cares? And Michael says, the joyfulness of dropping self-identity is wonderful, and it is counter to the often stated idea that Buddhism is fatalistic. And Bradley asks, if ignorance leads to a view of the world as separate objects, why is the view everything is one wrong view?
because that's viewing the world as being a single solid object. And also it's dismissing the experience of separate objects. So we're not, we still need to acknowledge the fact that there are ways of experiencing the world in which it seems to be composed of separate objects. So we can't neglect conventional reality. Neglecting conventional reality is just another form of delusion. It's just another form of ignorance. So an awakened being is simultaneously aware of both the conventional and the absolute. So an awakened being is fully aware that delusional beings perceive the world as separate objects, but they're also fully aware that it's not composed of separate objects. So the view everything is one is missing out on the fact that everything is also pluralistic. Neither perspective is absolutely true. Both are true from their own side, but neither is absolutely true. Also, the view everything is one verges dangerously into the view of existence. So Atthita, the view that things ultimately are real, that ultimately exist as a unity. But that's also not quite correct. So things cannot be spoken of as either existing or not existing. Similarly, unity cannot be spoken of as either existing or not existing. So the view everything is one is true from one perspective and not true from another perspective. That's why it's not sufficient as a final viewpoint. Okay?
And Karen says, do you have specific meditation advice for ridding ourselves of the habit of clinging to self?
Yeah, basically all of Buddhism. But the perception of impermanence is great for this. The perception of impermanence will gradually wear that away. Actually, silent illumination practice, if done properly, will gradually wear this away. Huatou practice is a very direct way of breaking it down. Any of the myriad anatta sanya, so recognition of not self practices, will gradually wear it away. Meditation on the 6 elements, when you get to the 6th element, will utterly shatter these viewpoints. Yeah, basically pretty much any insight practice in Buddhism will start to chip away at our self-identity. Yeah.
Yeah. And Bradley says, what's the relationship between the asavas and the 3 poisons?
So the 3 asavas are sensuality, existence, and ignorance. And sometimes there's a 4th one included, which is ditti, viewpoints and opinions. But that's also considered to be included under ignorance. So it's not always mentioned separately. And the 3 fires, which in the Pali Suttas, it's always called the 3 fires. In later texts, it started to be called the 3 poisons more commonly. But in the Pali text, it's called the 3 fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. They don't quite overlap. So sensuality and existence would both fit under greed. So wanting certain kinds of sensuality, wanting certain kinds of existence, which then implicitly includes aversion. So aversion to certain sensual experiences and aversion to certain forms of existence. And then ignorance lines up with delusion. So that's the relationship between the 2 sets. Okay.
And Sally is asking, what is the right thinking process to substitute the self-identity of I want to get enlightenment? For example, if I want to go to a meditation retreat, my parents don't want me to go to the monastery. If I insist on my view, then it strengthens the self ignoring their feeling.
So what we're doing for much of our Buddhist practice is we are substituting, replacing our old self-identity with a new self-identity, which is the self-identity of the sincere Buddhist practitioner. So while that is another form of self-identity, another form of craving and grasping and delusion, it is a self-identity which leads to transcending self-identity. So what we're doing is we're constructing a self-identity which will take us beyond self-identity. Okay.
And Bradley says, is agi the Pali term for fire in this case?
I actually don't remember off the top of my head. I have to look it up. Yeah. Agi is one of the words that's used for fire. But there's a couple others. I'd have to look up to see. I don't remember off the top of my head.
All right, that was the last question, unless another one pops up last minute. And I think Bhante is looking for agi. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look.
All right, so maybe you'll have immediate answer on this.
But in the meantime, are there any other questions?
Not yet.
Well, then we should probably go ahead and end for the day. Okay.
All right, unless you want to give the agi thing.
I'm not finding it quickly, so I would need a bit more time. I think we should go ahead and end.
Okay, so Bhante will follow up on the agi question, Bradley. All right, so thank you so much, Bhante, for sharing the Dharma this morning. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And thank you all for religiously meeting twice a day to practice Dhamma together. This is great. So I hope you're having a great, because we definitely are. And we'll see you in less than 12 hours at 7:30 p.m. for a talk on the parami of Nikkhamma, renunciation, featuring mystery monk.
Featuring one or more monastics.
Yes, we'll see. Who will it be?
Indeterminate gender.
You will only know by tuning in at 7:30 p.m. on BNN. All right, well, have a great